So can I talk from about here? No, that looks quite good. Okay. Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast special that's going to be giving you the rundown of 2020, or at least what we think might happen. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm quite happy to see that I'm opposite your actual face for once.
It's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's actually quite nice. So we've recorded together before. We've never actually been able to stare into each other's eyes, have we?
Yeah, it's oddly intimate. I mean, maybe if we share a kiss by the end of this podcast, I'm okay with that. So let's give that a go.
We're going to start off very quickly by running through last year's predictions and seeing how well we did. So, 2019 predictions. I've kind of typed up a summary of our episodes. We're not going to just throw in sound bites. If you want to go listen to that episode, it exists. It's on the internet. So let's start with Brexit, the big B. Rob, your prediction was quite short, and that was Article 50 not triggered on time extension. So a win, tick in the box.
Yeah, bang on. I'm happy about that one. Although I don't think that was the most outrageous prediction at the start of 2019. Theresa May had a lot of troubles. Like if you think back to a year ago, just before Christmas, that was when Theresa May first put her Brexit deal to Parliament, and it got rejected quite comprehensively. So there was obviously turbulent times on the horizon, and we all thought that she needed to get her deal passed by Christmas if there was any chance for it to be done by the deadline. So yeah, happy I got that one right, but I don't think it was the most outrageous of predictions.
No, I don't think. I mean, I was very concerned about no deal at the time. It seems like we've probably pushed that away for a bit at least. And I sighed a lot. But I did put out the very bold prediction that something would happen. Something did indeed happen. I kind of said we'd keep pushing the ball out of the court for 6 months or so, and that we would maybe get a modified deal, but not before March. So, I mean, I was doing pretty well until about halfway through the year. And we still haven't actually signed anything or gone through with anything. So, we're still, essentially 2019, we did very little on Brexit. There was just a lot of bluster. So next up, we had the Conservative Party. And Rob, you predicted we'd have Theresa May as leader for 2019. She would leave before the next election, but not in 2019. There would be lots of infighting. There would not be another no confidence vote, and there'd be an election in 2020.
I feel like... So obviously I missed the mark on this one, but only slightly. Come on, election in December wasn't too bad.
And I mean, Theresa May did leave before the next election. That's true.
Yeah. I agree that they couldn't fight the next election with her. The main reason I said that she wouldn't leave in 2019 is because the Conservatives did the no confidence vote within their own party before then, and there's a physical rule that stops them doing it a year, within a year. As it turned out, the general public's feeling towards the Conservative Party with the disastrous local election results and the European election results that happened after the Brexit had been extended for a third time into late November, wasn't it, back then? I'm trying to think of the exact date. October 31st. Yeah. As soon as we were given the October 31st deadline, people really did start to sour against Theresa May, and that was enough to put the pressure on her to step down and force a Conservative leadership election. Was there lots of infighting? Well, yeah, there was. I feel that we saw the rise of the RG and their kind of takeover of the party, their assumption of Boris Johnson as their main leader. And of course, he took the reins. And then we did have a no confidence vote, but it came from the other side of the. Oh no, I'm trying to think. Did we have There wasn't another no confidence vote.
No, there was no confidence vote. You're correct.
There was just lots of general election ones, and Boris Johnson saying, "Come on, have a no confidence vote in me if you think you're hard enough," and Labour going, "No, thank you."
Yeah, I mean, I went with someone could convince Theresa May to step down, but she might stay through Brexit. Because basically, my theory was that from the Conservative Party's point of view, she was useful as a scapegoat to pin all the problems on, but they seem to have actually managed to spin that around earlier and with Boris. So that I was wrong on. I said they felt a bit close to falling apart, but that the Conservatives would probably pull something out of the bag and not split in two, which they've done. They're stronger. They've got rid of all the people that weren't supporting the current party line. And once again, the Conservative Party is resurgent. They do this every time. It's like they're very good at it. My other thing I put in was Rees-Mogg would not be the next leader, which was quite an easy one to put in because he had said he wouldn't stand, but you never know. So I thought I would go with that. So coming around to the Labour Party, Rob, you went for People's Vote, ? And then you said Article 50 would be extended So Labour would keep saying to extend it until they get a better deal. Sadiq Khan would win the mayoral election in London, and Labour would do better in metro areas, but that an election, if it happened, was theirs to lose.
Yeah, again, sort of, well, I think I've got that mostly right. They did adopt the people's vote strategy for the election. In the end, that came under much pressure from their own party, or at least they didn't have a people's vote. They said they would have a second referendum if they won. And if they won, they would almost certainly need to extend the Brexit deadline beyond January 31st, because there would be little chance that they could get a referendum done and a deal done in that time. So, yeah, I think Labour's Brexit hand was really forced by the election, but there was a lot of rumbling throughout the year. The Sadiq Khan one, I mean, he did win London, but maybe I got my years wrong with when is the London mayor election?
I can't remember. I don't think it was this year that we voted, exactly. But yeah, no. I mean, I think he'll probably win again. Probably be we can bung that in 2020. That's all right. I need to double check on that.
I might have just got my dates wrong with that one, but yeah, I think when I said Labour to do better in metro elections and metro areas, that came true as well in the general election. That's where they were able to increase their vote share. It's just a lot of the rest of the country, and as we discussed in our previous episodes, particularly it seems in the northeast and the strong Leave voting areas of the north, they lost out, and that's what ultimately turned the tide of the election for them.
So my thoughts on Labour were, I said Corbyn could become untenable by the next election, because I think he was starting to have issues, and I was kind of saying if they're going to have a 2020 election, they want to get rid of Corbyn and swap him out for someone else who has a better chance of winning. So because he did very well, in my opinion, on the basis that no one really knew who he was and could present those policies. And I think, unfortunately, as we discussed in the last episode, as people started to get used to him in opposition, that has not gone so well for him. So I said that obviously I wasn't expecting a 2019 election, so that kind of threw that a bit out of the water. So I said new leader not in next year, but he will want to anoint the next one. Well, that's kind of happened, but he had to lose an election to force him out. That's the only difference there. And I also said he could annoy people both ways on Brexit, which I think has come to pass. So, yeah, not bad.
That's not bad at all. And yeah, just the anoint next leader part, we're seeing that with him being, it's usually the policy that if you lose an election, you kind of step down on election day. We've seen that from, I know Nick Clegg lost his seat and Joe Swinson lost his seat, but when Ed Miliband lost, he stepped down immediately. Corbyn didn't step down last time, but that wasn't really counted as a loss. It was a huge victory to even get a hung parliament. But for him to say he'll stay on, and yeah, it seems that Corbyn had finally got control of the Labour Party, particularly the internal politics is very Corbynized at the moment. And I feel that they don't want to just get rid of it completely. I think Rebecca Long Bailey is one of their choices, is a strong Corbynite and one that they would seek to support during the Labour election, whenever that is. I don't know if we've got a date yet or a time, but I think it might be early. Is it like March, April times?
Yeah, I think they said something like that. So we'll come around to it when we do 2020 predictions, but there's a list of potential candidates, but it's very much at the stage where some people have thrown their hat into the ring and some people aren't confirmed yet because nothing has officially happened. So moving on, our final topic for discussion was the USA, which we've had less coverage on this year, partly because Brexit's been, every time we've been like, we'll do an episode on the US a bit, Brexit's come along and sidelined it. So Rob put down that he was not going to build a wall. There'd be a frustrated, unhappy Trump who would lash out more, use more executive orders, and impeachment won't be successful, but he would lose staff.
Yeah, I think it's a bit 50-50 on this. I know that he hasn't built the wall, even though that's been a big talking point for him. A frustrated, unhappy Trump maybe wasn't the boldest prediction, but he does appear to have done a lot of that throughout his tenure, particularly on Twitter, but there's nothing new there. The executive order side of things, that was mainly because he would struggle to get anything through a democratically controlled Congress, which he really has. This has been a year of bluster rather than a year of action from the Trump administration, and one that has ultimately ended in impeachment. Now, I said impeachment wouldn't be successful. If I can clarify my marks and try and be selfishly and try and point this up as a win for myself, as in it would definitely pass Congress because the Democrats have the majority there, as we've seen. But will it pass the Senate? That seems very slim, with it being divided on party lines more than ever. I'd say it doesn't look like any Republican senators are budging, and there isn't a Nixon-esque type of oh goodness, the general public suddenly feel that you're bang to rights on this. I hope something will come out from this. Like, most importantly, Trump hasn't been on trial himself, and he may be forced to during the trial in the Senate. How he reacts to that, I think a lot of people are, particularly within the Republican Party, are worried how he might appear on camera and how he may lash out in the event of a judicial process like that. So there's still some hope that he may be removed, but public opinion would have to be swayed a long, long way before you see key Republicans abandoning him and forcing him out.
Yeah, so it has kind of go the same way as Watergate, where suddenly, but I mean, that did happen, so you never know, it's always possible, but I don't think this is necessarily as shocking to people as we would have liked, well, as people would have liked.
Yes. I mean, you look at Watergate, the public were divided very much on party lines for a long time. Everybody looks at Watergate from a past perspective and thinks it was an open and shut case, but it wasn't until those tapes were released and he seemed absolutely bang to rights that everybody got that. You haven't had that moment yet in this scandal, even though I think undoubtedly what he's done, the quid pro quo in Ukraine and all that, does seem very dodgy.
So I think it's fair to chalk yourself up as a win on that, because I said Trump will likely survive impeachment, House will have the vote, but won't go through the Senate. So I think that's because I was just clarifying to cover what I knew you meant, but was not necessarily said out loud. But if people are listening back, I think that's what we meant. I said no wall, which I don't think was a particularly bold claim. I also put more silly speeches, and because there's no big vote this year, I said he was just going to be in the news, which I think was, again, fairly... But he's always in the news, and not just because he's president. He's always making some kind of stupid pronouncement or whatever to keep himself in the news, and it feels like he's always there in the news. So, yeah, I think we did pretty well on that. I'm surprised. I mean, you compare that to our general elections predictions episode, where we were a bit off base, Rob less so than I. But, yeah, no, we've done pretty well overall for 2019 predictions. So moving on into 2020 predictions, I think we'll just do them in the same order. So do you have predictions on what's happening with the Brexit process this coming year?
Yeah, so very shortly on Brexit, I think we are going to... Boris has already passed his deal before Parliament. It's gone through its second reading, I believe, and it's likely to pass its third. Have no problem going through the House. This time the Lords will have to approve it. It won't get stalled there. And then Boris will proudly proclaim that Brexit is done and we won't hear very much about it in the news, which I think was kind of the message of his campaign. His message was that we've had 3 long years of talking about Brexit and nothing's been done. Now we will do the thing and we won't have to worry about it. The big problem with that is that, of course, it's just the withdrawal agreement. We need to negotiate the rest of it, which nobody's kind of considered, and how that discussions with the EU will go. And there's still kind of a threat of no deal, as in we've got Boris bizarrely gave himself another ticking clock of a year.
Yeah, that went so well for Theresa May. So I'm glad he's done that.
It was, what was it? He announced when he came into power, the markets recovered because they were like, oh, great, we're going to have loads of time. And then on his first day, he said, and we're going to give us a year to do it. And then the markets went down again, and everybody went, oh no, you've got all this uncertainty, you're going to dangle the carrot of no deal to try and get this done quicker. I don't know how well the threat of no deal is going to go with the European Union, or if they're likely to just shrug it off. A lot of the deal they've negotiated for the withdrawal, it doesn't have that year clause in it, does it? I don't believe in it. It doesn't have that in there. The EU haven't agreed to that year. So I think a lot of it is dependent on how the Parliament in Northern Ireland deals with it. And when they want to go, there's a lot more power given to Northern Ireland. And given the situation there's another potential mess. So I think Boris will fly high with thinking that Brexit's done and dusted for a long time until that no-deal clock starts ticking again. Then it'll appear in the news. Then you'll get the blame game where it'll say it's not our fault, it's the EU's fault. They're the ones stopping us. And we'll have another period of uncertainty. And it's how Boris deals with that. Is he brave enough to go for the no deal? Does he think the country is prepared enough? Does he think the EU will secede to his demands? Or will he just have to extend? And if he extends again, that could be a big blow because he was the man who was meant to get Brexit done. So a lot of what ifs and maybes, but all I can say with any certainty is he'll be flying on a Brexit high for a long time until right about this time next year, he'll suddenly go, oh dear, I've actually got to get something through.
Yeah, and I mean, it's slightly different, as we know. Boris has a majority, so and his party is for Brexit. But again, if he wants to go for an extension, a lot of them are not signed up for that on paper. So I think that's going to be, I think it's going to be a pain point there. But I mean, Brexit has not gone from the headlines. I would like to think that, I mean, maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised come March. We'll be like, oh, we haven't dealt with Brexit for a while. But I think so. If so, it'll be a kind of false, like a false calm where we're like, oh, well, Brexit's done, but it's not. There's almost stuff to do. And a lot of that involves civil servants and stuff behind the scenes. So maybe that does mean that Parliament on the day-to-day can discuss other things, which would be nice because it would be a bit of a change back to normality, which would, I think everyone would like at this point. That's kind of, I think that's a lot of why people voted the way they did in the last election, was people are bored of Brexit. I don't think that's, I think that's very fair to say. But so I think Brexit's definitely going to be bubbling along in the background. And I think I probably agree with you that we're going to get to about this time this next year, and it's all going to be sudden massive votes in the Commons again. And I don't know, I don't really want to be, I mean, this is the whole point of a prediction episode, to have to predict something. So I think we won't end up going for no deal, because I like to think that that's not what Boris wants, but I think he's trying to use the threat of it. So I think he will come round to the realization that that's not going to work, and it'll be messy for him, and that will probably, that won't be the end of him as PM, but it will be a rocky time for him as PM, because all the people who are like ERG and pro-Brexit in his party will be annoyed at him for having to extend. But I think that's probably the best decision in the long run. If we are going to have to Brexit, then we should make sure we actually sort everything out.
The difference between Boris and May on this point as well is that Boris has the majority, where he can ignore the ERG to some extent, and he can ignore the demands of the DUP.
Oh, yes. Yeah, because his majority was 63?
63, yeah.
So, and the ERG is maybe 30 people, I think we worked out, and DUP was 10. So, he doesn't have to worry about the DUP because they're not in his majority at all. So he has a leeway of about 30 people, but it does depend on who those people are, how tight those votes will be.
And I think just the final point on Brexit is the past 2 years, maybe, the debate has been, do we actually even go out at all? There's been a strong feeling, particularly amongst ardent Remainers, that there is some way to stop this process, stop Article 50, reverse it, maybe get another people's vote, and we can get rid of Brexit that way. I think that argument is kind of over with the election result, and so the Brexit conversation will now move on definitively to what type of Brexit are we going to get. And I think all sides on the House of Commons will have to move around. I think the Lib Dems are still going to be there saying Brexit's a stupid idea, but they will try and go for the softest Brexit possible and mitigate the hardest Brexit that I assume most of the Conservatives would want.
So talking about the Conservatives, on to predictions for the Conservative Party. I mean, they're in power, so we don't have to predict who are they going to be here next year. I think they're pretty set for the next 5 years with that majority. So maybe the thing to cover here, unless you have something specific you want to mention, is what do you think about manifesto promises other than Brexit, where they're going to go on those?
So yeah, that's the big problem, I think, for the Conservative Party, is once Brexit is out of the way, they have to consider their promises on the NHS, and particularly promises to those areas that they didn't expect to win, the North East. They're the people who will want the Conservatives to take a lead on that. Boris already went up there after the election and said, yes, we're going to do things for your area. We're going to, do these northern powerhouses and look at investment outside of cities. Stuff like that is a big Conservative mantra that they've been doing for a while now. But you've had 9 years of Conservative government, and we've just voted in the Conservatives to fix 9 years of Conservative problems, which is a bit bizarre. So how well they do with that will be interesting. They've got to turn the taps on with money. Every party suggested that the age of austerity is over, but the extent to which that is over is to be discovered and debated. And I think that will come into the headlines more, the state of the NHS, and you can't blame it on anyone else other than the Conservative Party. The only other thing that might hit the headlines as they push on is Conservative plans for boundary changes and changes on how you vote. So there was a promise in their manifesto that you may need an ID card to go and vote, which could stop mostly poorer people from voting who may not have the money to have a passport or a driving license. Also, the constituency boundary changes might make the first past the post system work even more in the favour of the Conservative Party, which is something that Labour would strongly contest. Now, they don't have the numbers in the Commons to stop that, but there have been occasions in the past where, particularly with the ID question, Tony Blair's government had one of the largest majorities in the Common. They tried to get ID cards through, and it didn't, due in main fact to a rebellion on their own backbenches. And I don't know if it's that much of a vote winner or that big of an issue for most Conservatives that they'll want to push that through. So I think look out for those issues outside of Brexit, that particularly those new MPs from the Northwest, or maybe not the traditional Conservatives, or maybe even some classical Conservatives who don't want too much state interference and don't want you to have an ID card. They might get their heckles up and vote that down. Even though it's been said in the Queen's speech as something that they want to get done during the next parliamentary session, those are the pressure points for the Conservative Party in getting some of those new, more right-wing deals through when they've had such a majority that maybe isn't very right-wing, which is more one nation Conservative or working class Conservative. They'll start to see some fractures.
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree with most of that. I think the one thing I'm interested in, and I think realistically in the next year they're not going to do much on, is all the parties were talking about the environment. And my prediction is that the Conservatives really aren't going to push on that because they've set themselves targets of 2050. So I think that's basically going to be ignored in the next year. And I wouldn't be surprised if that then leads to more Extinction Rebellion protests, more stuff from Greta Thunberg, things like that. So, I just think they're not good for that promise in the short term. I do think everyone agrees that in the long term it's going to be a vote winner, but I think pay attention to that because they were going on about that like, oh, they're as good as the others. And I'm like, well, you didn't promise as much as anyone else, and I don't agree that you're going to actually follow through on it.
The only thing that might change that, and I know it came up the day after the election, was flood defences. So you've got to think of the people just tend to care about climate change when it affects them most. So there's a massive debate going in Australia at the moment because bushfires are raging, and they have been raging for like months. It's an extended climate emergency, which has made lots of people kind of wake up and go, oh my goodness, we need to do something about this. Flooding tends to be the one that affects our country the most, or affects the most people. And it was a big criticism of the last Conservative government. They hadn't put enough money towards flood defences. So you may see that cry. That's where the Conservative environmental promises may come up first, is a request for flood defences, because they particularly came in areas that voted Conservative. Now, that shouldn't be a thing. You should want to protect all your constituencies, no matter how they voted. But there is an added incentive if they want to keep those voters on board. They're going to have to invest in flood defences. So that might be their climate change angle.
Yeah, I think it's also worth thinking about. So farmers and people in the countryside tend to vote Conservative. I was recently driving through after we had some pretty bad rains, and areas that aren't used to flooding as much. So I was driving through, for example, Buckinghamshire, which is where until recently it was John Bercow, so they didn't really have a vote there, but they now have a new Conservative MP. But if you look at the percentages, actually the Lib Dems were quite close on that Conservatives' tail. So it'll be interesting to see, because that's a place where there's HS2, which farmers don't like, despite the fact that Conservatives are kind of pushing it. I know there's been talk of them looking into it, but I have a feeling they might push ahead with it. So I think it'll be interesting to see how those kind of issues, now that Brexit is hopefully going to go away from being the main issue all the time, not that it's not going to be around, but I think people will be able to think about the other things they care about. It may be interesting to see how that plays out in some traditionally Conservative areas that might decide to flip in a future general election. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. One
final point, which I've only just thought of, so very quickly on the Conservatives, is that it'll be interesting to see if they continue with their pattern of Dominic Cummingsfication. I don't know. If they keep following the tactics of Dominic Cummings. So it was a bizarre election, as I mentioned, because the Conservatives didn't want to interact with traditional media as much. They wanted to avoid scrutiny. It was more done on feelings. And that was a tactic that worked for Dominic Cummings in the Brexit referendum. Then in the past 3 years, we've been kind of rerunning the Brexit referendum every day on the streets. So like with people, there's always the argument there. And now it's settled, and now they've won the election. Do they continue with those tactics? Do they continue to work? Or do they have to be grown-ups and just govern? I would prefer that they didn't keep going down that path and maybe sidelined him. For example, if you want to compare it to how Donald Trump worked, he had a lot of Bannon on side and kept Bannon close until he became a liability and got rid of him and sidelined him quite quickly. Does Boris follow the same route if Cummings saying, no, we don't want to do this? And people are like, no, we voted Conservatives. We wanted you to do this. You can't just fob us off. There isn't the boogeyman of Corbyn anymore. There won't be this big threat that he's not going to come into power. There's not the boogeyman that Brexit isn't going to get done. Do you need that sort of media and that populist themes still going on? Or do you go back to being a more like traditional Conservative way of managing your campaigns? The way they do that will be really interesting. I think they probably will. This is, again, not the boldest prediction, but they'll probably stick with Dominic Cummings until it stops working, and then they will get rid of him at a drop of a hat because he's not a traditional Conservative. You can just get rid of him, and I think...
Well, he's not an MP. I mean, he's just a special advisor. They pay him a lot of money, and they can just be like, oh, well, we don't agree with him anymore, and also he costs a lot of money. It looks good to get rid of him at that point.
But I don't think they'll be worried that he's running off to UKIP or the Brexit Party or anything like that. Like, them as a force, I hope, are a spent force. I predicted the UKIP was a spent force at the end of the referendum, and they were. It's just that Nigel Farage wasn't and could form his own party devoid of that. So
we'll move on to the Labour Party, who obviously are now out of power, reduced numbers in the Commons. And as we mentioned, Corbyn is going to be stepping down, and there's a process coming forwards for that. I'm maybe before we do our predictions here, I'll just run through the candidates that we know about. So this is from yesterday in The Guardian. So we already have declared Emily Thornberry, who I think most people will have heard of. Clive Lewis, who I'm less well aware of. He was Shadow Treasury Minister, but I don't know him very well. I basically only know him from this picture.
Yes.
Which is a picture of him pulling a slightly funny face that seems to be used everywhere because there aren't many photos of him. Rebecca Long-Bailey, who we mentioned. Sir Keir Starmer. Lisa Nandy, who again I don't know so well, but maybe you do. And then there's a few people who are considering running. And there's Ian Lavery, who has he was General Secretary of the National Union of Miners. I'm not sure I'm too aware of him. Yvette Cooper, some people are trying to get her to run. Jess Phillips, David Lammy, Dan Jarvis. So that's the kind of rundown there. You may or may not be aware of all of them depending on how closely you follow the Labour Party. But I imagine we will have an in-depth episode when that leadership race actually happens. But yeah, that's just to put in your mind who's thinking of running.
On that, like, very quick opinion on those candidates and who will do well. So your Emily Thornberry and Rebecca Long-Baileys are your traditional Corbynites. Like Highlander, there can probably only be one in the end. When it comes down to it, they will probably be unlikely to want to split the Corbynite vote. And unlike Jeremy Corbyn did when he was elected last time, I think you're not going to get over 50% in the first round. You're going to have to knock people out. And so one of those two will fall by the wayside, and then the Corbynites can unite around a candidate. The best thing about those is you've got two female leaders in there. I think it's the right time for Labour to have a female leader. I think they're the only major party now that hasn't had one. If you think about the SNP and Conservatives and the Lib Dems as well. So I think that might work in their favour. I'm not saying that they just have to have it because they're a woman, but I feel like the time is right that they could, it's not going to act as a disadvantage for them in that sense. People like Clive Lewis and Keir, Clive Lewis is sort of I know he was part of the Corbyn government and then stepped aside. He'll be more of the anti-Corbyn wing, I guess, or those looking who were involved, had to step aside, thinking that he could, run as leader. And again, along with Clive Lewis and you've got David Lammy, they're the two possible BAME candidates that could be the leader, the first leader of a major political party, which would again appeal very much to Labour's aesthetic, winning in metropolitan areas, that type of thing. I think it would be a good look for the Labour Party if they're able to get those in power. Then you're on to your Keir Starmer, who's probably my front runner for the election. Very front and centre. More people know who he is just because he was Shadow Brexit Secretary. Was in Labour under Corbyn, but kept a big enough distance away that he's not quite tainted with the same brush as Corbyn was, particularly with things like anti-Semitism, for example. He would be, he's not put into that same category. So he's probably the one that the Conservatives might fear the most. And I know on early YouGov polling, at least he is said as the most recognisable figure amongst those who are outside the Labour Party. And if he can garner the support from within the Labour Party is the other question, because we all know that Corbyn was seen as an outsider by many in the traditional media, but was able to get such a grassroots movement behind him that he ran away with it. So does Keir Starmer have the grassroots is the big question there. And then finally we're on to people like Jess Phillips, who is sort of a no-nonsense, tough-talking northerner, won in places where other Labour people lost and could be the one to win back those seats in the northeast. Seen as like more of a working class, like a traditional working class leader. Labour may have a problem at the moment as they're seen as very metropolitan liberal elite, I think. And if you look at where they won most of their votes in comparison to where they lost them, I don't think it's unfair to say that that's how they are perceived by the general public. Having her as a leader would be a shift in tone for that. Again, the next question is, does she have the support from within the party to bring them in that direction? She's the one who I've also, I don't know if this is just my Twitter bubble, there's a lot of Labour left infighting around Jess Phillips in the past, particularly on things that she said about trans rights and stuff like that, and how those are considered, which is a big point on Twitter in particular, and should be a big point when you come to being the leader of a party. So there's potential for infighting there. The big question for me about Labour is that there's been a battle for the soul of the Labour Party for the past 4 years, ever since Corbyn became leader in 2015. And he's slowly taken power through that party, mainly because he's got overwhelming grassroots support, which put him in great stead in 2017, but that's failed in 2019. And I don't think you can argue that, I don't think you argue that Jeremy Corbyn as a person failed in his bid to win a general election, and that his personal characteristics meant that they weren't able to win. The next question is, does Corbynism, the theories behind it, the policies behind it, does that survive, or does Labour have a leader that isn't Jeremy Corbyn but keeps those policies, or does it change its policies as well and go back to a more, I don't think they can go full Blairite again. I think that is too far to the right. I do think Corbyn has won the argument on a lot of things, on a lot of their policies to the left, but I think they might have to start moving slightly more to the right and slightly more to the central ground if they do wish to, challenge Boris Johnson and win those places back in the northeast in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've done a very good rundown of all of the different candidates there. I mean, if I was to put my money on it now, I think, as you say, Keir Starmer, people know who he is. He's kind of, while there are all those reasons why it would be good to have a female leader or a BAME leader, I think there is a tendency towards people playing safe when they've had a loss. So I think that's a point in his favour, because people see it as playing safe. Oh, he looks like a politician. All those kind of arguments you hear people say. Also, straw poll of the people I know personally who are strong Labour voters, a lot of them have said, oh, Keir Starmer, he's the one for me. So, again, that could be completely different. Maybe, as you say, there's a lot of grassroots people who supported Corbyn who may be like, no, we can't possibly have him in. But I think when you talk to general members of the public, they're pro that. So I know quite a few people who are paid up Labour members, but yes, I don't know if they're indicative of the larger membership. And also, I don't know if it's going to be held in March or something, as we suspect. I don't know how that works with people signing up, because when Corbyn was there's a whole thing about people rushing to sign up to vote for Corbyn and then saying, oh, well, you can't vote if you haven't been registered before this date. I think there's less of a worry of it, a sudden swing like that, but I don't know if there will be a kind of cutoff for people signing up. So it may be that someone could get a boost again from some kind of grassroots activism. Yeah,
I think particularly on that grassroots point, the battle for the soul of the Labour Party was won by Corbyn in 2017, when everybody suddenly thought, oh goodness, he's the one. And that might have forced a lot of people and maybe not a lot of people, but a few people to leave the Labour Party as a result of that. Because Corbyn was such a divisive leader, I know that a few people went away or said, oh, sorry, I could no longer, they lost Alistair Campbell, for goodness sake, to the Lib Dems. If you're losing people like that over your Brexit policy or that very tumultuous period when nobody quite knew where they stood before the election, before they put that in concrete, they lost a lot. They were leaking a lot of people to the Lib Dems. Those people might come back, and you don't know if people who were Jeremy Corbyn all the way, there's nobody but Jezza, if he leaves, I leave, if they're not going to vote in the next leadership election, or if they are willing to pass the torch on to an Emily Thornberry or a Rebecca Long-Bailey. If they're not willing and they leave and more people come in from who are Labour Lib Dem or more Remainer side of things, then that could swing the general election again. Sorry, not the general election, that could swing the Labour election again. So how the membership changes, how they're going to vote on this is really interesting. I doubt that you will see a candidate suddenly come out of nowhere like Jeremy Corbyn did in 2015. His was an outstanding use of social media, people thinking it was time for a change, a radical change within the Labour Party, and they have enacted that radical change. And I don't think that whoever is the next leader is going to undo that within a year. They're going to have to keep some elements of that to keep the, excuse the pun, momentum going within the Labour Party and keep those people on side, because I don't think large swathe of them are going to go away. And they're going to need to have that metropolitan support and keep it solid, but also find a way to maybe not. My worry with the Labour Party, as always, was that they're doing a great job of increasing votes where it didn't matter. They were bad at increasing votes in the key marginals. And there was a fantastic article I read in The Guardian or something. They leaked Labour's election strategy and talked about the top 50 seats that they targeted. I might go into depth in this in a future episode, but those at the top of the party, like Seamus Milne, ignored the polls and said, no, we are targeting these seats. And they lost heavily to the Conservatives, where they put big resources and money into those seats, and they neglected those northeastern seats, and as a result, lost them too. So whoever takes over as Labour leader has to just be a bit smarter about their election strategy and not maybe be so, it's great to have policies, it's great to have a vision, but you've got to put that in with some political nous and some tactics to, some compromises to appeal to voters where you think you might be able to sway them, because otherwise you're going to lose big, and you're going to lose in the big election like Jeremy Corbyn did this year.
Yeah, I think last year we didn't really do any predictions for the Lib Dems on the basis that they were running. I mean, they did have a leadership election, but they were running a fairly obvious Remain campaign. We kind of understood where they were, and I don't think anything was particularly surprising this year. We may have expected them to do better from number of seats in the election, considering they did better on vote share. But I mean, that's to do with how the system's set up. So do we want to briefly touch on the fact that at the moment the Lib Dems have acting joint leaders, so Ed Davey and Sal Brinton? Presumably there is then going to be a leadership election. I don't think anything has been announced, but do we just want to briefly touch on that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think out of those, you probably say Ed Davey is the front runner, even because
I
think
so. Yeah, because it was him versus Joe Swinson, and
it was fairly close. So yeah, he's probably the best, unless you. Sorry, excuse me. He's probably the best choice, unless you could take the argument that the party's already rejected him fairly recently. Why would they want to, elect him again? I forget how close it was that election, but the maybe the tactics of Joe Swinson were put into question, and I know the Lib Dems changed their strategy halfway through the campaign. They started off very big and bolshy with her saying, I can be the next Prime Minister, feeling that they could take a lot of seats off Labour if they went super Remain. When it was clear that wasn't going to happen, they walked that back a bit. And even though Jo ended up losing her seat, she was in quite a tight marginal anyway, so the Lib Dems may wish to avoid that situation happening again with their leaders. It's happened, I think, Tim Farron kept his seat, but Nick Clegg was leader and lost his seat in Sheffield Hallam, and now Joe Swinson's done it. They might want a bit more of a safe Lib Dem seat, so when it comes to the next general election, they can at least go into it knowing that, our leader will be able to affect some change.
I think the only thought I'm going to throw into that is that there was a bit of churn in the Lib Dem ranks, because they lost several seats and also gained several seats. So while the overall net loss was 1, that means there's a few new faces who we know very little about at this stage, but maybe one of them could be a surprise leadership candidate. But no, I think I'd agree with you. Living in Ed Davey's seat, I know that he got an even stronger majority this year against the local Conservative candidate, and I don't expect that's going to change for a while, because we briefly had a Conservative MP for 2 years between 2015 and 2017 because people voted against him because of his involvement in the coalition. And now basically we had 2 years of a Conservative MP who didn't get much done, and people have then gone back to the Lib Dems. And I think that's probably where the seat is going to stay. So he is, as you say, probably going to be fairly safe. And that's the thing to consider, someone who could be a leader for longer than the next general election, possibly.
My final point on the Lib Dems is I think it will be a struggle for them to find a new USP. So what's their unique selling point between all the other parties? For the last few years, they've been able to run with "We are the one true Remain party." And you can argue about that electoral success, but it certainly kept them in the conversation and relevant. And you know why the Lib Dems exist, because that's what they want to do. They also, in recent times, tried to become the party of the centre again, with the Conservatives moving further to the right and Labour moving further to the left. The Lib Dems were trying to get people from both sides and accepting both Conservatives and ex-Labour MPs into their ranks as a result. Now, they might find a bit of a squeeze if Boris decides that he's not going to be as right-wing as he can be, to try and force the party into a more one nation direction because he won those seats in the northeast. Then they may struggle in Conservative Liberal constituencies. On the flip side, if Labour say, oh goodness, we were too left-wing that time, we've got to move back to the centre, then they're going to struggle. Do they remain the party of the centre, or do they do what they did during the Blairite years and decide to be the new party of the left? That's kind of how they got a lot of their success in 2010. They were, it seems odd to say now, but they were the party of the young, they were the party of the metropolitan areas. They kind of had that Corbyn vote share in 2010, but then lost it immediately by going into coalition with the Conservatives. So how they adapt to that new challenge, they're lucky they've got 5 years to find their niche now again, and they may appreciate the fact that the Lib Dems can do what they are probably best at, in my opinion, which is strong local government, getting a big local fan base, and then turning out, making sure you turn out. So areas like Bath, where I think they increased their, majority this time round, they can say, no, we are the Liberal Democrats, do a good job for Bath. They've already respected Bath. Vote for us because we do a good job. I think they can probably apply that where they are strong. So they're not going to, I don't think the Liberal Party is going to collapse completely and become an irrelevance. But the new message that they've got in the next 5 years is something that I don't think I can instantly say off the top of my head. What's it going to be? Likely they'll be fighting for a softer Brexit, but I feel it's hard to be the party of we'll remain and we're going to overturn Article 50 in the current environment. That doesn't seem very tenable.
Yeah, moving on from that. So we've discussed the UK pretty in depth there. Thoughts on the USA? So we have a election this year. Yeah, and I think, we're definitely going to do some coverage of that. Fortunately, hopefully it's not clashing with too many Brexity things, but I think we will actually have a bit of time to look at the US this year, again, like we did in the first year. So there's Trump, obviously, as the Republican candidate, and we have the Democrats still trying to pick a candidate. So sweeping generalizations or some kind of prediction about this?
Yeah, so I'll start with Trump. Trump was a unique candidate in that he started his presidential election campaign or registered it like a couple of months after he'd won the first. So he's started his campaign early, and in a way, the last 3 years of Trump have seemed like a constant campaign. He's always putting himself into the news and picking fights and wanting to have a go at Democrats and not really governing. He's a guy who stands for a lot of things, but I don't know how much he's achieved. So he will maybe struggle on that fact, but that doesn't matter because maybe he's demonized the Democratic Party to so many areas of support and got his core fan base amongst people that he feels he can just go into the next election keep whipping up that kind of, I am the true American, I am the guy who's going to get things done, keep the talk and the bluster, and ignore the fact that, he's not actually done much, which was the key to his success last time. So then you have to flip to the Democratic side. How do you defeat a man like that? You need to have a united Democratic Party who knows what it stands for and can cut through that bluster and say to people, no, you really need to look beyond the simplistic facts Trump is giving you. Yes, the economy might be doing well, but do you feel better off? Do you feel better under this government than you did under that? The big problem for the Democrats is that I can see Groundhog Day happening. I can see the same fight happening between Joe Biden, who is likely to win the Democratic primary because, like Hillary Clinton, he has the support amongst the core central base of Americans, and because he has the support amongst most of the centrist Democratic Party that is the majority of the Democratic Party, and because their primary process is so much larger than how you elect a leader in the UK, you have those massive primaries, and eventually he'll get the votes to push him over the line. Bernie Sanders is still there and still having quite a left-wing platform, and I think that somebody like Bernie will have his influence on Biden's policies, and the Democrats will be forced to go to the left a little bit more than they did under Hillary Clinton. But they've really got to make sure they retain those Bernie voters rather than get rid of them, because it was a theory that people had after the last election in 2016 that Bernie would have beaten Trump because your centrist Democrats would have gone along with Bernie because they definitely didn't want Trump. And those people who really like Bernie, instead of not voting at all, they would turn out and vote, and that might have swung you, particularly in those Midwestern states. The problem is I can see the same thing happening again, and Trump could win the election, he could win the Electoral College again, but I don't feel that he will win the popular vote again. I think that's fair to say. It's mad that incumbents always have this massive advantage in American politics. And Trump, I think, will benefit from that. The impeachment scandal just seems to have solidified his defense, and there doesn't seem to be many people who are jumping ship. The battle lines are drawn pretty square now, aren't they? And if Trump wasn't to be elected, then I think you could see a lot of vitriol amongst those who, really strong supporters of him, and there'll be allegations of, well, there were allegations even after he won, wasn't there, that there was vote rigging and stuff like that. So we'll see the same old Trump do what he does, and I don't think enough Americans are turned off of that yet. He's still been able to keep a core 40% going. The Democrats just need to get it together if they want to defeat it. But at the moment, I don't see that happening. I'd be interested to see what happens when there is a much narrower field, and if you get the big primary debates that suddenly become, look, if Bernie Sanders comes out, I know he did against Hillary and said, look, supporters, you've got to vote for Hillary now. I'm sorry. I don't know if Biden has the same degree of unpopularity that Hillary did. Hillary was like Jeremy Corbyn, almost was for Labour in this election. She was so divisive that even though Boris Johnson was equally divisive, they cancelled each other out. They just need a popular leader, and boy, would they kill to have Obama back. Because Obama is still overwhelmingly supported throughout the rest of America to a point where they wish they could have him in charge. That's the problem. I think Biden is too much of a Hillary or has that same brush and has that same infighting amongst Democrats that they might blow it again. I hope they don't, but I can see it playing out exactly the same.
I mean, I think that's how I think it's probably going to play out as well. But I think I'm going to throw in one other prediction. I think it's going to be Biden v. Warren for the actual Democratic thing. I think that Bernie. I have a feeling that Bernie could drop out earlier for other. I mean, he's had health issues and other things, so I think that's the thing that might be slightly interesting about that race. But I mean, realistically, I think Biden will probably win it. As you said, he is the front runner at the moment, unless there's some terrible scandal waiting. But I mean, we saw that Trump was going all the way over to Ukraine to kind of try and dig up dirt and hasn't really achieved anything. I think if there was significant dirt, we would have found it out from the impeachment inquiry right now. So yeah, I think he's probably going to win it. There is some talk I have heard, because I listened to, there's a good podcast, Left, Right and Centre, that I recommend listening to, because they have a guy who writes for one of the right-wing newspapers over there. So you get quite a good view of what the right thinks. And he's someone who doesn't really like Trump, but is obviously a Republican and supports Trump because he's their leader at the moment. Maybe there's a possibility of someone who's a bit more central kind of activating some of the centrists who voted for Trump. But again, it's a bit, especially if it's not like with the UK where we feel like we mostly have our finger on the pulse. I mean, even then we're stuck in a particular bubble and sometimes make incorrect predictions about things to do with Brexit. But over there, I think it's even harder for us to kind of guess from across an ocean what's going on. But you do see, you see similar kind of things in the news as we saw after the Brexit referendum, where people saying, I think I made the wrong decision. And you see people saying that with Trump. But the question is it like two people who they've managed to get on for a TV interview, or is it a larger number of people? And I think that's what will sway it. But yeah, I have a feeling Trump will win again, and it will be another sad night for the Democrats. But, maybe something will happen that will significantly shake everything up. Maybe
the point you said there is correct, that with the Brexit referendum, there were two very clear sides, and then we have this general election where the Conservatives won. But then when you tally up the votes of parties that wanted to do Brexit just outright and those that wanted a second vote, actually those that want a second vote won by 52 to 48, because there are no other numbers in politics. Everything is 52 to 48 now. Maybe on the US side, because there are two main parties to such a great extent, and I think there may be some people who I saw, was it Susan? I don't want to put any celebrities under the bus. There was a particular celebrity who was voting for the Green Party, and she said, Hillary's going to win anyway, so you need to vote Green. It's important that you vote Green to, put pressure on her to do Green. And even though that might not have affected some races, there's that risk that, am I really going to vote for a third party now if I really do want to get Trump out? So it might be the case that, again, they all rally and come out and try and get rid of him. But again, it's a strategy point of view. The Democrats lost their blue wall. They lost support with their key working class voters to Trump. Can they win those people back? Have they got a better strategy this year? Do they really need to have somebody who's going to increase their vote share in California? Because they're going to win California anyway. They kind of need a Midwestern leader or somebody who can give them those votes in those key areas, or they're at a big risk of repeating the mistakes of 2016. This is a prediction episode. Those are our predictions. We will be back in the new year with our regularly scheduled programming. As always, you can find us at parliamentary.observer. You can find us at patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support all of our shows. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unpal Podcast. And you can find us on Reddit at /r/Unparliamentary. I'm just going to quickly say that there was going to be kind of a Q&A episode from the election stuff, but basically I tried pulling out all those different Q&A questions and there wasn't really enough to make a full episode. So maybe I'll release something on the Patreon for people to have access to. But it's not gonna be this week. This is this week's special, and then we'll get back to normal life probably in the next 2 weeks. And then we'll be back on our normal schedule. So yeah, I did say I was going to make a bonus episode out of those, but I cut it out to make the election episode kind of to the point, and then now I kind of have to go and piece all those questions out because they kind of came a bit thick and fast halfway through the episode for various reasons. So yeah, I'll cut that together maybe as a kind of bonus thing, but it won't be released as a podcast. So I don't think there's anything else left to say other than it's good night from me. And it's a good night from him. Bye. 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 So now if we're talking, you should see I'm appearing on this microphone. And I'm appearing on this microphone. Hello. Now, I know quite a few people who are paid up Labour members, who are paid up Labour members, but